Would you push the button to end global poverty, but all governments would shift to socialism?
No.
Good answer.
No, because the reality says in the Bible, it says there will always be the poor.
Welcome to ProlesSquad.
Hello and welcome to ProlesSquad, your bi-weekly dose of history, politics, and culture, without the liberalism. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at ProlesPod and on TikTok at proles.pod. If you want to help us reach more people, leaving 5-star reviews on any of the various podcast catchers is the best way to do that. If you want to help us with our vision, you can subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/ProlesPod. There's a lot of great stuff there, such as early access to main feed episodes, bonus episodes, theory beats, study guides, raffles, surprise drops, and more, with more on the way. This episode, as always, is brought to you by our wonderful patrons, but today we're going to be talking about one big blanket and some other sort of hilarious arguments against communism. This should be a fun one, folks. The one big blanket part of the episode title comes from one of the many hilarious arguments that you've heard many, many times before. Sharing toothbrushes, the nationalization of women, and in the case of this episode's title, all comrades sharing one big ass blanket for one big bed on the collective farm, which was an actual lie, which was spread by the Orthodox priests during collectivization, which began in the late 1920s in the USSR. Because we all know humongous beds and blankets are key dogmas of the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism. The purpose of this episode is pretty straightforward. We're all going to take a look at some of the most ironic, stupidest, most hilarious, ill-conceived arguments used against communism from Marx's day down to our own. But first, who do we have with us today?
Justin.
We got Tony.
Ray.
And I guess, Ray, you want to take it away? Begin the conversation?
Before we get into any of the myths, I think one of the central features of all the communist myths come down to a lot of misinformation around communism, relying on inaccurate representations of Marxist ideas of property relations, right? A lot of anti-capitalism, whatever that tendency may be, relies on an understanding of and a disagreement with capitalist concepts of property and ownership. So that's where we'll start. Within capitalism, okay, I'm sorry if I'm talking down to anyone, but maybe some people don't know, or also what we're trying to kind of do with this episode, right, is like give you language to say it to somebody else. So maybe you already know, but maybe a simpler way for you to say it to somebody else, right? Within capitalism, there's what we can call the capital class or the owning class. With their capital, and capital is money that basically gets invested in becoming the only owning class. It's money that gets invested in making more money. They usually own two things. The means of production, which is, for example, land, equipment, other resources used to produce goods or services, aka products. So like the things, the means necessary to produce or for production, right? The means of production. They are also like the rentier class in that they own things that people need to live, like housing, and they rent those things back to the people who can't afford to be in the capital or owning class, okay? So Marx sees this and correctly...
I don't know what just happened.
That's staying in.
Yeah, for sure.
That is
That's going to be the new DJ DTA track.
that is like the whitest scat. Was it scat, right?
Scat, yeah.
Yeah,
It's the whitest scat
The
I've
whitest
ever heard.
scat, the untold story of Ray. So Marx sees this, the owning class, the rentier class, and correctly acknowledges that this is like fucked up, right? He also acknowledges that the people who can't be a part of the owning class are forced to sell their labor power for a wage in order to live. And he's like, as they say, where I live, no bueno. So here we have to make a distinction between personal and private property because capitalists and Western propagandists love to like conflate the two, right? So personal property is the stuff that you need to live and to enjoy your life. So your house, your clothes, your car, your art collection, the aforementioned toothbrushes, blankets, beds, etc. Anti-capitalists are for you owning that stuff for yourself. Like, yes, of course, there have been movements towards socializing or sharing certain kinds of labor, like a community kitchen or like a daycare center, right? That would be socializing like the labor of cooking or the labor of childcare. But like, you aren't renting your house or like borrowing your bed from the state. Okay. The point is that you would own all of that. By comparison, private property is property that could be collectively owned, except it has become privatized so that the owning class can profit off of it. The obvious and the classic sort of example of this in Marx's time was the factory, right? So like the workers could, in theory, collectively just own their factory and share their profits. But instead, a person or a small group of people who had the capital, right, the money required to invest in making more money, they don't work in the factory, they just own it. And so the ownership of the factory has been privatized, which leaves the workers at the mercy of the owning class and therefore both exploitable and exploited. It also leads to this sort of like endless downward spiral of owning and privatizing more and more and more. So, right, it starts with like the enclosure of the commonly held lands, but now we live in a world where it's like all of the land is privatized, all of the water, the minerals in the ground, the fucking movies on a fucking streaming platform, like everything is designed to make you have to rent absolutely anything, but also the owning class aren't responsible for the damage, especially like ecological damage, right? Caused by their extraction, and all of that gets gets projected back onto the commons, like the commonly held people, like we pay it with our taxes or whatever.
And like you mentioned that everything is privately owned. For people who are not, excuse me, for people who are not aware of U.S.
Oh, so if Jeremy makes a mistake, that doesn't get left in. Nobody's laughing
He's going
about
through
that.
puberty.
Okay.
It's not
It
fair to
wasn't
make fun
funny.
of him.
It wasn't as funny as the meow,
Scooter
the scat meow.
Meow.
It wasn't as funny as the whitest scat. Continue.
For people who are not familiar with like property rights here in the United States, you may own your land for your personal use, but you do not mostly own the mineral rights or water, sometimes even the water rights below your property. And so other companies quite often do. So you may own a piece of farmland that you do subsistence farming on, but GE owns the rights to the fucking whatever, the minerals underneath it, or fucking GE is probably a bad example, but whatever. Halliburton owns the natural gas that's underneath your land. Should it be discovered.
Which is like compared to countries that nationalize those resources. So it's like, yes, you may still not own, I guess if they find like lithium on your property or the water, a lot of countries like you can't own the water, but neither can a corporation. It is like
Right.
nationally owned and held for the good of all of the people who live in that country.
Correct. Whereas in the United States, you own the surface, basically the layer of soil that is on your property, and really nothing underneath that, which is really shitty when the company that owns it decides they're like, oh, well, I'm gonna drill a well on your property. You have no, like, they are allowed easement onto your property to drill a hole in the ground. And then you are then suffering the results of the pollution and the like degradation of your property that takes place as a result of that, which is really dope.
You're also not allowed to collect rainwater.
Well, that's a Colorado thing.
Oh, okay.
I mean, there are other states that do
No,
it as
other
well,
places,
too,
yes,
but yeah.
yes. It's not federal, but there are definitely other
Yeah.
places where you can't like pick fruit or plants or collect rainwater. And we can get into that. It actually segues really well into how the first myth is like communism is when they take your house.
Yeah.
If you guys are good, we can move into it. But like I'm about to share a little bit more about how like even when you own your house, you actually never
No, go for it.
your house.
Yeah, do it.
Okay, so yes, we have made the distinction between personal and private property and this specific kind of relationship to property. that we see under capitalism, which is not apparent in many indigenous cultures, not apparent in socialism. Like it's different kinds of relationship. Okay, so we like laid that out, and now we will get into the first myth, which is like communism is when you don't own anything, and that includes your house. To continue with what Jeremy was just saying, to use the US, for example, home ownership rates in the US, I looked them up, are about 60%. By the way, even when they were pushing for the subprime mortgages in the early 2000s, supposedly to help people become homeowners, the homeownership rates peaked a couple years before the bubble crash in 2005, and they were still like 69%, which is what the home ownership rates are more or less in the EU now. So it was like somewhere between like a 7 and 9% increase, like even at the height. And then it went down to like slightly below 60% as all of those people had their homes foreclosed upon after the bubble popped. Now we can just compare that to homeowner rates in socialist and formerly socialist countries. So we've got Laos, the global leader. Everybody forgets about Laos. Hey, by the way, if you want to listen to 2 fantastic episodes about Laos, I don't know if you guys know this, but Tony has another podcast called Actually Existing Socialism.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that.
And I think probably like half the downloads of the Lao episodes are like me sending it to people because I loved it so much. So please go listen to those. Often forgot about socialist country, Lao. Romania and Kazakhstan, at last report, come in at 95%. China, Vietnam, Cuba, all right around 90%. And hey, by the way, compared to the former British colony of Hong Kong, where home ownership rates are, do you want to guess?
40%.
22.
Holy shit.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Even the like social democratic, like the Nordic countries, they're all between like 60 and 80. Denmark is at the lower end, Norway is at the highest. But even being up close around 80, it still doesn't crack like the top 10 countries in the world. So now about ownership, getting into the granularity. If you buy a house, for example, in the US, first of all, no, you didn't, because you probably have a mortgage. And if you miss your mortgage payments, well, the bank takes your house because actually the bank owns your house. But then even if you paid it off or paid for it in cash, most states, there's a couple who don't, but most states have property taxes. They're quite high, by the way, compared to other countries that have property taxes. So if you miss your property tax payment, you can also lose your house. Plus, now they sell like condos and apartments being sold as like more affordable options, but then you have condo fees. And so these aren't the same thing. These are in addition to like the utilities and the services of the common areas. No, these are just like fees to be there, imposed by like the development companies or whatever. And if you miss paying those, they can shut off your utilities or take your house. So the homeownership rates, quote unquote, homeownership rates are already low. But then if you actually look, they're basically zero because at every turn, there's still a possibility where you can't own your fucking house. So if someone, I'm so sorry, I don't know what to tell you. If someone can just come and take your house, like you don't own that.
Mm-hmm. It's true. And even if we qualify homeownership as somebody that owns their house outright, it's still only about 30% in the US.
And most of those people are ancient motherfuckers.
Yep.
Yeah.
They're either, they themselves are very old or that house was paid off and they inherited it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So, which I'll get into inheritance a little bit in a second. Yet again, though, with our homeownership myths, every accusation is a confession because, again, in capitalist countries, you don't really own your home, even if you do. But in socialist or former socialist countries, a lot of people do own their homes and like truly, truly own them, right? Like notoriously, I think this has been going around on social media a lot. Like China doesn't have property tax, so you pay once and you own it. Plus, I looked it up, by the way, mortgage rates in China are currently 3.1% versus 6.8% in the US. So then, as was just brought up, the issue of inheritance. Marx and Engels write extensively on the relationship between inheritance and patriarchy, as well as inheritance and wealth hoarding. So basically like passing the property down through generational lines is one way that wealthy people stay wealthy and poorer people stay poor, as well as like when you have to name and identify who the father is, especially when there is this like patriarchal relationship where basically like you own your children, like your children are property. It reinforces a certain kind of nuclear family wherein the woman is dependent on her husband for like safety and security, which we're actually going to talk about in myth number 2, rather than having like her own opportunities or like having the state be able to provide for just her as an individual, not as somebody else's dependent. I do want to know, obviously, like several of the countries with high homeownership still allow for inheritance. But one, I want to acknowledge that those countries have a much higher inheritance tax than the West. And two, those are countries where it's just less fucking impossible to own a home in the first place. So like, yes, it is helpful to inherit property, but it's also not the only help that is available for people to own their property.
And if you consider like the percentage of home ownership rates in these countries, then basically everybody is getting wealthier every generation rather than like some people are getting way more wealthy and some people are getting more impoverished, because as like if you've paid off a property and you inherit that or you pass it on to your children, they don't have a house payment, they don't have rent to pay, right? And so their lives are better than your life was. And if 96% of people own their property, that means that most of the people in your country are having a better life every subsequent generation. Every subsequent generation has a better and better and better life because they have fewer expenses.
And I think that this also highlights something that we're going to talk about more in myth 2, but is also applicable in myth 1, which is choice. So again, as somebody who used to live in Vietnam, never shuts up about it. The only 3 things I love are my husband, Vietnam, and abortions. In Vietnam, for example, I had friends that were my age at the time, so they would have been in their 20s, and many of them didn't own their homes, but it's not because they couldn't. It was because, for example, they wanted to come to a big city for a specialty degree, but when they were ready, they wanted to go back to their province and buy or build something at that time, right? That maybe they wanted to relocate for a specific period of time, or for maybe other specific complex reasons didn't feel capable of like the responsibility of owning their own house, but they had a choice. It wasn't like, I'm curious, and I kind of looked it up, but I couldn't find anything about the discrepancy, not just between homeownership, but homeownership and the percentage of people who would own a home if they could. Because at least in my experience, most of the people that I knew who didn't have a home that they owned was because they wanted to live somewhere else for a short period of time and didn't really see the point in buying a house. They wanted to like rent an apartment that was near their job or their university or their kid's school for a couple of years or whatever. Versus, I think in America, the homeownership rates are very low. But if you ask most people, like if they had the choice, if you're like, why don't you buy a house? Most of them would be like, I can't afford it. Very few of them would be like, I'm not up for the responsibility of homeownership. Or
it's actually more like my credit's not good enough because mortgage payments are across the board lower than rent payments.
Quite often, yeah.
I can't. Right. Somehow, whatever it is like, I can't. Not, I don't want to. I would if I could, but I can't.
Right.
Versus I think in a lot of these countries with higher rates of home ownership, they can. I'm not saying it's like totally easy for everyone's going to buy it for the same cost as like a lunch or something like that. They would have to save up some money, allocate some resources, but it's not a priority for a specific reason usually that isn't just financial. I guess we can move into our second communist myth, which is like communism is when big love. So like hide your wife, hide your kids. Everyone is polyamorous in the revolution. So based on what I have already sort of unpacked, this should already be self-explanatory. Women are not property. No one is sharing wives non-consensually. But not only that, I've got a little Soviet example here to remind you that the Communist Project has pretty much always been about creating the conditions for equality, stability, and abundance so that people can pursue whatever they want in life, but specifically love matches and healthy, conscious, respectful relationships rather than being like forcibly tied to unhappy or even unsafe relationships, literally just for like a place to live or for healthcare or for food. So I'm going to bring up the essay, Make Way for Winged Arrows, a letter to working youth by Alexandra Kollontai. It's quite short. Everybody, you could just go pause this and read it right now. I've seen it listed as having been written in 1923, but also 1925. So somewhere in the first half of the 20s. Basically, she is speaking to the casual sexual attitudes that were so prevalent during this period. And she's calling, the name that she's giving it is wingless arrows compared to winged arrows, right? So she's saying, look, like this isn't ideal, what y'all are doing, but I do totally get it. Like you were focused on the war. And like, again, I just want to point out, remember, these folks, some of them have lived through the Tsarist Revolution, World War I, and the Soviet Revolution. So like now, right, like we would understand that these people are like a traumatized population, right? Like these would be people with like CPTSD, for example. So she's basically like, look, I know you've been focused on other stuff. I know you've been focused on the revolution. You weren't motivated by long-term ideals of like family or romance or love or anything like that. And this is exacerbated in a way by the first family code, right? Because the Soviets are like, if you guys remember, we discussed this in the Stalin eras, we want you to leave bad marriages, right? Like they try to make it easier. They try to make fathers pay child support. They try to provide for single mothers. And they also try to provide opportunities for young women who would otherwise, right, like feel forced into marriage for economic reasons at this stage in their lives. But again, we can see how there's this sort of like, I don't want to say backlash or overcorrection because I don't really want to judge it, but there's a lot of like non-committed casual sex, a lot of short-term flings. And honestly, like Lennon, notable wellness girly, is completely like shocked and like horrified by this, right? But Alexandra Kollontai is like, no, babes, I totally get it. You want to be free. I understand that. You want to try things. But like, let me tell you that this path of wingless arrows, this is not freedom. This is just a reaction to your current conditions. And what we want is to help you make better conditions and better choices, right? AKA make way for the winged arrows, make way for the kind of love that would be representative of like a well and healthy and stable and balanced and flourishing life, right? So while the West like loves to paint her and communists in general as like, I don't know, like free love hippies who don't own anything, which again, like is predicated on a belief that like you own your partner, right? that you own your spouse, right? That monogamy is this extension of like property ownership, basically, right? The opposite is true. The Soviets, and especially through the work of Alexandra Kollontai that I'm using as the example, were invested in a project of creating the material conditions where people would have the opportunity to build honest and healthy, committed relationships that weren't based on societal pressures or economic needs. And obviously, if you want like more resources on this, Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism by Kristen Gotzi, another classic. Again, when you get back to the heart of everything, it's a misunderstanding of like who owns what and what property is. And when you stop seeing other fucking people as property or the potential to be your property, it's very clear that this is not the communist argument. It never has been.
And it is like, this is one of those that also goes back to the same source sort of we drew on was the Anna Louise Strong book, where the one big blanket was one of the things that was going around. But the priests were also going around telling the peasants that they were going to nationalize their wives. And anybody would be able to have access to them. And I'm just like,
which again is predicated on the belief that women are a resource.
Yes. And property. And
that you can be nationalized like petrol.
And then people wonder why the Soviets like launched so many anti-religion campaigns.
Yeah. Yeah. And you'd think that would be like a dead in the water sort of argument, but I've heard it recently, and I mean really recently, like within the last 2 weeks, I heard somebody say, oh, well, I guess your wife is my property now too, huh, comrade? That kind of shit. Yeah, good times.
Which, like, hey, also not to trivialize the very real fact that a lot of people engaging in leftist spaces still face patriarchal views, still face sexism, still face a lot of those attitudes that are latent in people. And not to say that the men who purport and endorse those attitudes like don't have agency and aren't making choices themselves. They obviously are, and like fuck y'all. But again, that like those attitudes are more likely to arise under a specific kind of material condition.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Winter temperatures got you down? Comrades in the kolkhoz starting to frown? You need something warm, not just for yourself. Leave Grandma's quilt on the farmhouse shelf and reach for one big blanket. That's One Big Blanket, made of 100% fleece and designed to cover the whole collective farm. That's right, your family, your neighbor's family, that one guy who always smells a bit like stale vodka. Even the chickens will be toasty warm under one big blanket. And don't worry about the price. One Big Blanket is Stalin approved and distributed by your local commissar, Dave. Heck, scoot on over and make room for Dave under One Big Blanket. And now, back to the show. All right, so we've talked a little bit about, communists having communism doesn't want you to have your own personal property, or that we're going to collectivize your spouse or your children or whatever. What else we got? Tony, what you got?
Yeah, so this is less of a myth and more of an argument, an anti-communist argument that is made to try and take socialism down a few pegs, I guess. And it is perhaps, if I may be so bold, the dumbest argument against socialism. Because when you rationally kind of take a look and examine this one, it actually turns out to be perhaps one of the best, or like one of the most easily understandable arguments for socialism. So over the past 200 years or so, every objectively progressive, good, honorable, right thing to do has been called communist or socialist in a derogatory way by those wanting to uphold the status quo, which, using the American terminology, liberals and conservatives. Here, I'm going to be addressing arguments when anti-communists apply socialism to good things and not when they do it to things that are obviously caused by capitalism or just failures of capitalism themselves.
Sure.
This is total aside, but just the other day, Lauren Boebert, a very famous American politician, I guess,
From Colorado.
And philosopher.
and philosopher, political economist, etc.
Yeah.
She was on Fox News and she said that in regards to the market fluctuations caused by the tariffs, she went on Fox News and I think was on Lauren Ingram show, whatever, and she said that Wall Street is full of communists selling their stocks to hurt President Trump.
Oh, guys, I'm moving home. If Wall Street's full of communists, I'm moving back to the States.
Yeah.
So I'm not even gonna touch that absurdity. I'm gonna actually address the things that are good that they apply to socialism. So an example of this argument that's been around for a long time is that if you look back at during the attempts to abolish slavery in the 1800s, a very common argument made by pro-slavery advocates was that those who want to abolish slavery were all communists or socialists to some degree. And in fact, here's actually a quote from George Fitzhugh, who was a pro-slavery advocate in 1857. He wrote this entire book talking about how awesome slavery was. And this book was called Cannibals All, or Slaves Without Masters. Not so sure about that title. Not great. But he goes on to write this in that book where he says, I shall in effect say, in the course of my argument, that every theoretical abolitionist at the North is a socialist or communist, and proposes or approves of radical changes in the organization of society. We warn the North that every one of the leading abolitionists is agitating the Negro slavery question merely as a means to attain ulterior ends, and those ends nearer home. They know that men once fairly committed to Negro slavery agitation, they are, in effect, committed to socialism and communism, to no private property, to no church, no law, no government, to free love, free lands, free women, and free churches.
Okay, so all of these arguments are at least as old as 59, you said?
57, yeah. So
57. Yeah. Okay, so those are all the same arguments we've just been talking about, yeah?
Yes.
Amazing. They even predate the Soviet Union.
Almost 200 years later.
Yeah.
So this kind of rhetoric that is used can be applied to virtually every social advancement in the past 200 years. Women's rights, social security, employment insurance, labor rights, universal health care, LGBTQ rights, anti-racist legislation, wearing fucking masks. I wish when in our social studies classes, because I went to an American school growing up, I wish in these classes that we weren't just taught that there were these, movements for a certain thing, like say, for example, civil rights in America, and then there was an opposing movement, people who wanted to maintain segregation. What we never get into is the details of the rhetoric and the arguments that were made. Because if we did, it would be so fucking clear to us that this is one thing I hate so much is today when conservatives will be like,
not just
what
that, it was like when you and I watched The Sympathizer, 10 hours of a war about, I don't know, cousins fighting.
Yeah, exactly. So say for example, you'll be some host on Fox News talking about shit and it's like, oh, this isn't racist. What are you talking about? I'm not saying anything about black. But it's like, dude, you're literally saying verbatim what segregationists were saying in the 1950s. But
yeah,
that isn't so clear to people because we don't learn what they actually said or what they actually did.
Yeah, or how socialists are always, well, I almost said there were some Trotskyist organizations that were pro pedophilia back in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, but we won't talk about that. They weren't all Trotskyists. Some of them were anarchist or weird left liberals. But yeah, no, it was a thing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for left groups to like agitate in favor of pedophilia because they treated it like homosexuality as like a sexual orientation.
There was also that West German scientist that literally housed 14 teenage boys with known pedophiliacs because he believed that that would be the best way to integrate them into adulthood.
Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, but for the most part, socialists tend to be on the right side of history at every turn.
Yeah, no, and this is very true. This is a very common thing that you hear people say. So it's like kind of like what's one way you can like kind of respond to it if you see it online or whatever, right? So the way I imagine myself always responding to this now is, that meme template of the Chad guy saying yes? Like that's what you say when they're like, communism is like universal health. You want universal health care? That's communism. Chad meme, yes. Like, that's how you respond, right?
Yeah.
Because as we've just discussed, what this argument demonstrates is that literally all positive social change in the modern era, going back to 1800s, emanates from socialist revolutionaries, socialist activists, socialist states. Really, I mean, if we can apply broader, any really anti-capitalist movement in the past 200 years has been at the forefront of all these progressive changes.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not a coincidence that after the fall of the Soviet Union is when you see this massive resurgence of, like, I guess I don't want to say counter-revolution, but I don't know what else to say, against all of these policies that were adopted in response to the communist countries' propaganda.
Yeah, no, exactly. So within like even capitalist countries, the people making these changes were often socialists of various stripes, but also perhaps more importantly for people in the West during the 20th century was this example of the Soviet Union, this quote unquote threatening example of the Soviet Union, in which the elites in the West understood that, hey, if we don't start implementing some of these systems that the Soviet Union are using in their country, whether that's a universal healthcare system, a daycare system, whatever it is, they understood that they had to implement these reforms in order to avoid revolutions in their own country. So
Right.
as Justin mentioned, once the Soviet Union fell, that's when we see a huge decline in these social services and rights that people had in the West. You can respond by just acknowledging like, yes, actually, like socialists are in fact the leaders of change in society. Thank you. The second thing that you could say to that is really, it's quite ironic, is going back to that first example of abolitionists being, I guess, derogatorily tarred as communists or whatever. What that means is that if you're someone conservative today who thinks slavery is wrong, right? You could make the point to that person and be like, hey, you know what? During Karl Marx's time, you would have been considered a communist because you were against slavery,
Right.
Even like the most arch conservatives today, like let's use J.D. Vance, right? I mean, his wife is not a white woman. She's not even a Christian like himself, right? These are things that would have been literally race mixing as communism, is one of those popular phrases during the segregation era. And it's like he's clearly in violation of that. So does that make him a communist, or is there something else going on here that we need to better understand communism with? So I'll just kind of leave you guys with that one there.
Not to mention, right, the whole argument of like, oh, race mixing is communism, which is like a favorite one that's trotted out, is also trotted out by the same people who are like, America is a melting pot. So
Yeah.
it's like there's a good way to do it and a bad way to do it. And the good way to do it is like whatever America is doing, even though America, the United States, is still an incredibly segregated society.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is like the way everybody else, the communist way, that is like somehow bad, even though they're like the same thing.
So the next thing I'm going to address it very quickly is this confusion about China. Even under Biden, right? The U.S. has been responding to China's advancements in green tech, whether that's solar panels or electric vehicles, that really been pushed through the Chinese government's subsidization of their different industries. And in response, the response has been very perplexing, because everyone listening to this has heard at some point that planned economies or economies that are run almost in a top-down sense or with major kind of public oversight do not work. They suffer with innovation that leads to shortages. They're not efficient. It leads to famines. Like whatever it is, that's the one thing that we've heard repeatedly. We still hear it every now and then, right? But then now there's China today, And China's just crushing the market when it comes to or technology when it comes to electric vehicles and other green tech. So as a result, what we've seen from people like Biden, from Hillary Clinton, from the Trump administration is that, hey, China's subsidization of their industries isn't fair, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that we've got to get smarter about how we deal with the economic threat. And for people who say, oh, well, you know, that disrupts the market. China has disrupted the market. China is not a free market economy. We tried. We let them into the World Trade Organization. We sent our businesses over there. We made trade deals. They are a controlled top-down economy. You will never compete and win against them unless you take back the means of production.
They are they're doing the free markets better than us. So as a result, we have to not make the market free, because if we make it free, if we ourselves don't interfere with tariff or with whatever the case may be, then China's system is either on one end, it's a communist country that has a planned economy in a sense to a degree, right? That people are going to disagree with that or whatever. But then on the other sense, they are supposedly, according to capitalists, a capitalist country as well, right? So it's like, which is it? There's kind of a muddled sense when it comes to the perspective on China that makes it appear that planned economies are in fact a threat to the capitalist world system. But it's like they're also inefficient and don't work and don't have innovation. So that's kind of one confused perspective that you'll often see online when people discourse about China.
It's predicated on just one belief, one presupposition, which is just like a country that is doing well is doing capitalism, and a country that is doing badly is doing communism, period. And by the way, a country only refers to its oligarchs.
Yeah.
Not to its regular citizens.
Yeah, well, and it's there's like a few things there. One, like they will argue that anything bad that China does is because of communism, and anything good that China does is because they have capitalism. But like and I've heard this argument before that it's not fair because China subsidizes its economy, but so does the United States. Like, we give trillions of dollars to the defense industry. It's just, where does that money go? The money does not go to the people who live here. In a broad sense, it goes to the shareholders and the board of directors and the CEO
bank bailouts,
and
the military.
Yes, we subsidize business a lot. It is just not in any way that helps average working class people, which is the difference, I suppose, between here and China. But also, China strategically subsidizes industries that it knows are going to help with exports, and it knows are going to make its citizenry and itself more wealthy. The whole green tech movement is huge, and the vast majority of solar panels that we get here in the United States come from China. I don't know. Yeah, it's stupid. Justin, you got a weird anti-communist argument?
Okay, so this is a big one that you hear a lot from, especially from conservatives, although I would guess if we went back in time that we would continuously hear back and forth, right? Like, I'm sure that Reagan in the early 80s was talking about people having guns as communism, but 70s, I mean. But it is the idea that communism is when government take guns away. And this is a very nuanced argument because it is neither black nor white. Let's start at the beginning, right? So Marx famously says, under no pretext should arms and ammunition be surrendered. Any attempt to disarm the workers must be frustrated by force if necessary. And you'll see this, quote thrown around a lot. It does, however, have context, right? Marx isn't advocating, and maybe he did, but certainly in this quote, he isn't advocating that communist countries ensure that everyone has a gun. That probably be dangerous, certainly for the state. But he is talking specifically about how we, as revolutionaries, planning to, hypothetically, CIA, overthrow the government.
Just discussing the
We're just discussing hypotheticals here, guys.
In Minecraft or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. that if someone wanted to overthrow the government, they would need weapons in order to do that. And so if you are living in a country, hypothetically, that wanted to overthrow that government, that you would need to ensure at all costs that they could not disarm you. Now, let's move forward to when communist, socialist countries began to pop up, starting with the Soviet Union. And you see there's kind of like a nuanced idea. I know, hard to imagine. But the Soviet Union began with the ability for people to have guns, weapons, if they owned those weapons. However, and then on top of that, I'll get into what they started with, and that continued. But after Kirov was assassinated, there was a confiscation of guns that were not like dispensed by the government as part of your job, and so they did take guns in order to ensure essentially that people could not just assassinate others at will. And this is, in my opinion, a fair move, considering that so many people had weapons that they had been hoarding since the revolution, that it was really easy to like counter revolt. And they did, I mean, we know about, if you go back to the Stalin eras, we know about all of the plots to assassinate various leaders. And so they did try to go in and take guns. They actually asked people to voluntarily surrender them, and I think they gave them something in return. I can't remember, but they didn't like go door to door like kicking in people's closets, because they continued to find stashes of guns as they were arresting people for conspiracy.
Also, though, isn't this just sort of like Leninism 101, that like before the revolution and after the revolution,
They're different stages.
there are two different sets of rules, right? Yeah, exactly.
There has to be. Yeah, there necessarily has to be. And the idea, especially in a country that is constantly under assault, and every country that's socialist is constantly under assault, except Laos, I guess. But
only because everyone forgets about them, which they wouldn't if they would listen to Tony's other podcast, Actually Existing Socialism.
Yes, exactly.
He's paying me for these ads, by
Nice.
the way.
I need to get on that. Yeah, so, and then beyond that, from the inception to the end, there were communal armories, essentially, that people could go to and rent for free weapons in order to go hunting or whatever it was that they needed to do at that specific time. I don't know all the gun laws for all the other socialist countries, but I would assume it's probably something similar. They, again, like I said, when you're constantly people are trying to infiltrate your country and assassinate you or spark a counter revolution, you can't just allow people to stash a bunch of weapons. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty straightforward, I guess. Like it should be obvious to anybody who is a materialist that when the material conditions change, your attitude towards one thing or another ought to change as well. Before the revolution, it is very important that we all have guns, and after the revolution, much less important, and probably important for the sake of preventing counter-revolution to adjust the gun policy within that nation.
It's not dissimilar to like freedom of speech, right? When you're living in a capitalist country, it is essential that we fight tooth and nail to ensure freedom of speech so that we can continue to propagandize. But after the revolution, it is essential to have strict freedom of speech laws in order to stop counter-revolution.
And at least specifically with the gun laws, again, I don't know every stage of how the gun laws have been, for example, in Vietnam, but like when I was there until now, yes, like gun ownership is like very, very, very heavily regulated. It's like practically illegal for a civilian. And that's incredibly popular. Like Vietnamese people are like, yeah, no shit. Like, like it's the first thing that they always say. Like, if I have friends, of course, I also have friends that maybe they lived abroad, went to school abroad, visited family or whatever. But of course, I also have a lot of friends who've never traveled to the United States, for example. And like one of the first questions they always ask, or like I remember, the little that I worked in schools, people would ask all the time, like kids, like teenagers would ask, like, does everyone really have a gun? That's crazy. And I'd be like, well, no, not everyone, but like, yeah, like a lot more people than here. And they were like, that's ridiculous. I can't believe that. Your mother let you go outside? Like, they're very, yes, it's the law, but it's also like a law that is democratically upheld by an incredibly large majority of the population, knowing that, like, yeah, sure. Hey, look, like, especially in the cities, pickpocketing definitely still happens. And like, I had a knife pulled on me once. I know other people that happened to, but like, that's it, right? Like, somebody's got their like rusty garden knife, and like your biggest threat in that moment is tetanus,
Yeah. Well, I guess kind of moving on to the next section, this will be a little bit of a free for all, I suppose. We could talk about how, like, there's this perception that socialist countries have these veneers of good things to trick tourists and journalists and whatever into only seeing the positive aspects of that country. This gets levied at the DPRK probably more than any other country in the history of socialist countries, where like anybody who goes there and they're like, oh, everybody looked happy and like they were having fun, and they're like, well, yeah, that's because the fucking people walking down the streets are all actors, and the water park that everybody gets to go to is actually like, that's only for the elites of the party and their children, and like whatever. I mean, I don't know. What's everybody's take on this shit?
So yeah, no, I'd agree that it's something definitely that comes up the most when you hear about the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or also commonly known as North Korea. I've had the opportunity to talk with different tour guides who frequented
on your other podcast.
On my other podcast, I wasn't gonna name it. I wasn't gonna, but if you're going to, I'm not gonna say, Ray, stop, please don't. Like, I'm not gonna do that.
Please stop, don't.
Yeah, so spoke with tour guides about this, and like, it is very common for people, even people who have paid or were on the trip themselves, to like point at something and be like, oh, I think that is fake, or that they're dusting the trees because the trees are fake, or like whatever it is. A common thing is that it's like the people don't speak, like, because if you're out in Pyongyang, there are people out there, like there'll be an event happening or people just walking around or riding their bike or whatever, and often they'll be like, oh, these people are like forbidden from speaking to me or whatever it is. But one of these tour guides pointed out to me was that most people in the DPRK don't speak English, right? So it's like, if you know a little Korean, you can have a conversation with them. You can say hi, you can ask them how their day is going, and they'll most likely respond, or not. I mean, no one is forced to speak with you, which is another kind of, I think, perhaps a Western expectation that if you
absolutely
come across somebody in a different country, they must direct their attention and their focus and their life to you in that moment to demonstrate the reality of existence.
To you and your hospitality, because Western entitlement is such that like the world actually is your resort. It is your playground. And like, if you're there, everyone is there for you.
Well, and I think part of that comes from like the expectation that people get from watching Western media, where somebody goes to another country and everybody's like, oh my God, it's an American. Let's talk to them. Let's have a good time. Let's have a party. Let's go to the fucking pub in Ireland and everybody's going to sing songs with me and drink beer with me and whatever. And that's the expectation that particularly people from the US, but I imagine Westerners in general get, that like, oh, if I go to another country, I'm like an anomaly and people are going to love to see me there and we're going to have a good time and I'm going to learn all about their country. And
it's a self-fulfilling prophecy too, right? Because that attitude obviously predates any kind of like social or digital media, right? Like, this is just like the Western mentality of like, you're all here just like for
main
me,
character
right?
syndrome.
I mean, Japan was constructed for this purpose, right? As like a U.S. playground.
And is continually being reconstructed for it. But what's ironic to me about this is that the countries against which this argument is like most levied, right? Like China, DPRK, are countries that are not particularly easy to visit. It's quite difficult and cost prohibitive to get a visa to visit these countries, and a lot of people can't visit these countries. Cuba, I think, is another one that they say this about quite often. And it's basically like, okay, so then like, if you step back from this and just think for like 10 seconds, it's like, okay, well, if I had an entire economy that was predicated on regular citizens walking around as paid actors as this like Disney foreign playground, then would I not want to make it as easy as possible for tourists to actually visit the country? But in fact, it's like quite difficult to visit DPRK or to visit China or to visit Cuba, especially if you're an American.
To that point, Ray, I guess the question is, who's making it prohibitive? Because actually, from what I understand, it's relatively easy to get that visa to the DPRK or to Cuba or whatever it is. It's particularly the U.S. And their sanctions against
Yeah,
them.
the
Which,
United States was for a period of time allowing tourists to go to the DPRK, but they have revoked that, and you are now, if you can do it.
And to Cuba, and there were a bunch of people who went and were like, oh, it's really cool. And they were like, oh shit, you can't go.
But like and I guess you can still do it, but it's just very fucking hard to do. And there was somebody who, like, and I'm missing the details, I forget now, but it was like a tourist who was from the United States who went to China and then went into the DPRK on a special visa. But when he came back and he went back to the United States, the border patrol were like held him and were like, what the fuck were you doing in the DPRK? They got interrogated for it. And like, yeah, freedom. And it's not like socialist countries do not, to some degree, put up a front for outsiders because they feel like they have to.
But so does that is what tourism is. That is what tourism is.
It is not limited to socialist
in any
countries,
country.
but yes, they do. And again, like I know I keep talking about Anna Louise Strong. We really need to do an episode on her. When she was talking to her friend who ran the orphanage or worked for the orphanage, she was frustrated because they were not accepting more orphans. There were more orphans who were available who could have been helped within the context of that orphanage, but they were not being allowed in because they didn't want it to seem overcrowded because it was like the model orphanage. Not that it was the only orphanage. There were other orphanages which were taking other children in, but this one was was for show for the press, the foreign press, and so they didn't want it to look overcrowded, and so they did not accept additional orphans. And that's not amazing, but that's also not the same as this is all fake, because the people who were there were helping children, and they were not the only orphanage in the city. They were just the model one, which is where they were taking the press. And that's part of propaganda.
I mean, you see this today this happens today, for example, like in Cambodia, there are places that are called orphanages, and they're designed because they like get money from churches, from missionaries who just want to send teenagers who have no skills doing fucking anything and just want them to feel like they're helping, but they pay to go on these trips. And the kids in these orphanages are not often actually orphans, especially in the Cambodian conceptualization, where you could be raised by an extended family member, and many people have quite large families. It's just that maybe your family members are poor, maybe they are addicts, maybe they're very traumatized or dealing with mental health issues, maybe they are themselves disabled and for whatever complicated myriad reasons are unable to take care of you. So you go to these basically like socialized childcare centers that you basically live at, if not full-time, most of the time. And that's what the tourists are coming to. And like, yes, I guess like that is fake and for tourists, but it's also like a very real thing that is happening, and they're just calling it something else so that they can receive the funding and the aid that they actually need. And I think that this is true of a lot of the like voluntourism projects. Is like you're going there and you're there because you've paid money, not because you're actually doing anything. And if you have to think that you're doing something in order to help, then like that sucks, but so be it.
But also that, like you said, this is not limited to socialist countries. If you go to to like Mexico and you go to a resort town, you will quite typically fly in. I mean, I've never done it, but I've heard stories, right? Like you'll fly into like an airport, and then you will get on a shuttle and be taken directly to the resort, which has walls, massive walls all the way around it. And then they have guards watching the ends of the beach in both directions so that poor people don't get in. They don't want you to see the rest of the country. They only want you to see the nice parts, and this happens in other countries as well.
Not even nice parts, the parts that are constructed for you and to your tastes.
Yes.
So even in places like I think Cancun, I mean, the rates of crime in Quintana Roo have been going up in recent years a little bit, but by and large, Cancun is a pretty safe place to be. It's not that you're going to find it; you're just literally going to find like regular food that is made for regular people, not food that is like not spicy and has like different kind of cheese on it to be like more to your taste.
Well, and like it happens in the Caribbean as well. It happens on Jamaica. It happens in the Dominican Republic. And I had a friend who was like, I'm not going to do the resort thing in Jamaica. I'm just going to rent a car and I'm going to like go around and see the real Jamaica. And she was like, it's not like it is in the resorts. It's not like, she was like, they rented a car and twice they had to stop on the side of the road and roll a tire to a mechanic to have it repaired because there was no such thing as like AAA or whatever who could come out and do it on the spot and replace your tire for you, because that sort of infrastructure is something that exists for people who have money, and nobody in the rural areas of Jamaica has the money to support that kind of infrastructure. And so they would just like, they would get a flat tire because they hit like a massive fucking pothole and it would destroy the wheel. And then they would have to like jack the fucking car up and then try to find, like ask around and find where the nearest mechanic was, roll the tire by itself to the mechanic, roll it back and change it. And she was like, I wish I hadn't done that, because like it took like hours and hours and hours out of their vacation. And she was like, it was just everywhere I looked, everybody was sort of like in some state of like impoverished misery, you know, and like, but that's why the resorts don't want you to see that shit. They want you to be like, oh, Jamaica's awesome. I had a great time in Jamaica. I went and hung out on the beach the whole fucking time. And
because they rely on that tourist money,
Yes.
and they can give you a superior service and they can charge you for it.
But of course, only a handful of people in those countries are getting rich, which is not the same thing as the DPRK, where everybody has a basic standard of living, which is decent.
And therefore, they don't need to get a part-time side gig
Yeah.
pretending to be actor citizens walking the streets for tourists.
But like, let's be honest here for a second. That wouldn't be the worst job to have.
Right.
To be an actor. Right? You know what I'm saying? It's like,
yeah, it'd be great.
it's like, okay, we need you. It's like, we need you to like walk in the background about like 40 meters away from the tourist. Act like you're talking, okay?
Act like you're
Okay,
happy.
got it? Okay, go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I was just paid to like walk around and look like I was shopping on the high street,
Yeah.
like I'm not going to say no to that job.
Zero unemployment in the DPRK, confirmed.
I mean, it's the same argument as the homeless people in China, right? When people are like, well, where are all the homeless people? They put them away somewhere, and it's like, you mean
In houses.
in housing?
Yeah.
Right. I think, Jeremy, you should talk about our visit to the DMZ.
I mean, that was, yeah. So this is kind of a weird one. So when our father was stationed on a bombing range in Korea, in the shit Korea, the Republic of Korea, and it was a weird situation. You would be amazed, like just as like an aside, you would be amazed how many people in South Korea, in the Republic of Korea, hate Americans, hate the United States, hate the US military, and want them gone. A huge amount. Like, I know there's this perception amongst communists that like the South are massive bootleggers and they love the United States and all of this shit. And certainly the wealthy people in Korea have an appreciation for what the United States does to keep socialism from like growing in the South. Many people in the South hate the United States and hate the U.S. military.
Also, the U.S. military and their like love of prostitution in Korea is fucking disgusting.
It is, and like there is, and it's not just the military machine in a general sense. Like U.S. service members quite often sexually assault Korean nationals at an insanely high rate. When we were there, it was like every week or every couple of weeks, there'd be a new story in the military newspaper about somebody who had been charged with sexual assault, bar or on a street or in a home somewhere. It's fucking rampant. So anyway, I guess that's just as an aside.
And that is like with having military curfew. That is with having specific bars that either allow or disallow military members. I say this as I lived there as a civilian. And when you get a work permit as a foreigner in Korea, they have to test you for STDs, STIs. And you might think like, it sounds really fucked up. Obviously at the time I was like quite young and I didn't really understand. Like, I was like, that's so crazy because of the rampant sexual assault that Korea has rates like very, very, very high rates of hepatitis. I think it's like 1 in 6 or 1 in 7, which is like very high for a developed nation. And like I went to a gynecologist once who was like, we have strands of STIs here that I've never seen. She was Indian, grew up in India, and then like moved to Korea to practice gynecology. And she was like, we have strands of STIs here I've never seen anywhere else. And it is just like well known that this comes as a result of a lot of like foreign service members, which is like really horrifying but true.
And it happens everywhere the US military goes. Like this was a problem in England as well. It's just way more pronounced in Asia, and there's really gross racist reasons for that, but I'm not going to get into it. Anyway, but like while we were there, our family went and visited the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Is it the 48th parallel? I forget. This sort of artificial division that the United States created between the North and the South. And it is like full of landmines, and it's a very surreal experience. There are like villages on both sides of the border that are like right against the DMZ. But there is this barrier section of, I forget how much distance it is, a quarter mile, half a mile or whatever, in both directions, where nobody is allowed to go, I suppose, unless they are part of the military and guarding I think in Korea they call it the joint security area. But regardless, when you get there, you get this like extensive talking to that's like, you will actually walk briefly into the DPRK and then walk through and then come back inside the building where they hold like formal meetings. Like when Trump met Kim Jong-un, he did so in this building. It's this like Cold War era. It's not very nice. It's very small and it's kind of shitty building with like cheap green carpet in it. It's kind of bizarre. But anyway, you will walk through this building and you will be in the North. And then you go outside the building. You kind of walk through this concrete area and then you walk back into the building. And they're like, do not smile. Do not wave, do not point at the guards because they will take a picture of you and they'll use it for anti-American propaganda. And like,
Sweet.
Yeah. And I'm like, okay. I mean, if I probably would have gotten arrested, but I probably should have went like, yay, hi. But yeah, I mean, like, it's a weird sort of like, they do have what they call the propaganda village, which is an uninhabited sort of structure that has like big painted signs in Korean, and they blast music and sort of propaganda out of the speakers 24/7, which is kind of funny. But like, I don't know, it's whatever. Like, it's a whatever situation.
Yeah, but it's just to me, it's interesting parallel to like what we're talking about as far as guiding and whatever propaganda. They do the same.
Yeah, they do the same thing in the South.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say, that South Korea has like several folk villages that it is understood that like, yes, people like live within the proximity and like sometimes that is like their actual like home where they live within the village. But like it is understood that people go there during the day to do like artisanal crafts for tourists, to do artisanal activities for tourists. Like it is well understood that that is like the purpose of these villages. And there are many of them. That they literally are paid actors walking around looking like they're living there. That is the point.
I don't know. It's a weird accusation to lob specifically at communist countries when there are so many examples globally in capitalist countries of the same shit happening or slightly different and quite often worse. Like the examples of sort of tourist resorts in impoverished peripheral nations. It is also, all of that is fake too, and all of that is done to impress you. But the result is all of that money goes into the pockets of a handful of rich people, most of whom don't live in that country.
And even if like one could like argue that the tourist visits, you know, they're a form of like propaganda, of course, by these socialist countries, but it's just like that's the form of propaganda that perhaps people in the West may be exposed to. Meanwhile, it's like we have things like Hollywood, right, and the much more expensive forms of propaganda networks that exist for Western capitalist countries, which are far more intrusive, far more, I guess, undercover, so to speak, whether that's USAID or whatever it is.
Yeah. Anything else we want to say, or you want me to go ahead and land this plane?
Let's land this plane while we're building
While we're building the plane, while we're designing the plane, while we're crashing the plane.
Or actors on the plane.
Actors on the plane. All right. Well, that about does it for this roundtable episode. Thank you so much to all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers. The newest ones are Pablo S., Jake C., Balthazar, RMND, Preston E., Jake, Will, Alfred, Eileen C., Asatar B. Is that Asatar? I don't know. Eric B., Randall P., Hagen, Vivek B., and Red Under the Bed. And a very special shout out to our Vanguard patrons, Audie Jim, the Leninist Lawyer, B, Lil Lumpenprol, the Winking Cossack, Talking Socks, Comrade Chihuahua, and Better Red Than Liberal. Once again, if you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/ProlesPod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at ProlesPod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, all that algorithm stuff, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. May the Spectre haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.